students, and see what Wordsworth is saying. Before I see another day, oh, let my body die away. In sleep I heard the northern gleams, the stars that were among my dreams. In sleep did I behold the skies, I saw the cracking flashes drive, and yet they are upon my eyes, and yet I am alive. Before I see another day, oh, let my body die away. My fire is dead, it knew no pain, yet it is dead, and I remain. All stiff with ice the ashes lie, and they are dead, and I will die. When I was well, I wished to live, for clothes, for warmth, for wood, for fire. But they to me no joy can give, no pleasure now, and no desire. Then here contented will I lie, alone I cannot fear to die. It's a little difficult, my dear students, for you to imagine who is this forsaken Indian woman. You have to think of the Red Indians as moving from one place to another. So lots of them, hundreds of them are moving, are migrating because of the cruel season probably. Probably because they have no food, probably because they've got no land to till, probably because the incoming foreigners have driven them out of their own lands. You have to think of these Red Indians, and they're moving further and further. And then you have somebody who is weak, somebody who is ill, somebody who is sick, somebody who is handicapped by physical debilitating disease maybe, by illness maybe, by weakness maybe, and finds it impossible to walk. So what does this person do? That person is left behind. The person cannot move on at the same speed with all the others. So this Indian woman is the forsaken Indian woman. Her family, her friends, they have all moved away. If they have moved away, you understand that she has been forsaken. The desire to live is now dead. And that is why she says, when I was alive, I wanted clothes and I wanted food and I wanted joy and I wanted happiness. She goes on and on. But now, since she doesn't want to live, she can only pray for death. Alone, I cannot fear to die. I want to move from here to a totally different kind of poem. Look at the screen, my dear friends. I have a poem called The Thorn. Now, in a poem like The Thorn, you will notice that there is a combination of both nature and human experience. All of you have seen thorns, and you know that the thorn is not something which one would like to take in one's hand. But here, the thorn is a reference to a big tree, so old, and therefore, he says, there's a thorn, it looks so old. In truth, you'd find it hard to say how it could ever have been young. It looks so old and grey. Not higher than a 2 years child, it stands erect, this aged thorn. No leaves it has, no thorny points, it is a mass of knotted joints. A wretched thing forlorn, it stands erect, and like a stone with lichens it is overgrown. I've been talking to you about the language of Wordsworth, the language of the lyrical ballads. I'd like to draw your attention to the kind of imagery that these poets are able to bring. Look at the metaphors, look at the similes. I'm sure you know these figures of speech. These are the commonest ones that you find almost we use every day, even in speech, even in ordinary conversation. I say it's hot as fire. I say it's cold as ice. So too, in poetry, you find metaphors and similes. The thorn is actually an old tree. You must have seen, trees where the branches are dead. There are no leaves, but the stump is still standing. The trunk is still standing. Now, this is one such tree. Notice how the description draws to your mind an entire image. If you just shut your eyes and try to imagine what he is talking about, you will get a picture of the number of trees that you have seen of this kind. Because it has no branches, it has got no leaves. What is its height? No higher than a 2 years child. You can imagine, how tall is it? 3 feet? Because it's only the trunk which is standing. And then there is a mood which is being created. My dear students, that is also important. We don't read a poem just for the description. We read a poem also because what it conveys. And what it conveys is the experience of the poet. What it conveys is the mood. It could be a happy, joyful mood. It could be a melancholy mood. It could be a mood of nostalgia, as you must have read in some poems like Tears, Idle Tears. Of course, another age, another poet. I'm talking of the Victorian poet Tennyson. But you must have seen how each poem creates a different kind of mood. Here, the mood that he is trying to create for us, not trying, I'd say he's succeeding in creating for us, is something of old age and all that goes with it. We have talked of the beauty of nature. Maybe some of you would remember Keats's poem, The Ode to a Nightingale, where he talks about old age, where thin grey hairs, sceptre thin and dies, where youth grows pale. So you have the contrast of youth. Here, like rock or stone, it is overgrown. Do look at your poem again on the screen, my dear students. Like rock or stone, it is overgrown, with lichens to the very top, and hung with heavy tufts of moss, a melancholy crop. Up from the earth these mosses creep, and this poor thorn, they clasp it round. They are parasites. You know, the lichens and the mosses, they are parasites. And this poor thorn, they clasp it round so close. You'd say that they were bent with plain and manifest intent to drag it to the ground. And all had joined in one endeavor to bury this poor thorn forever. It looks as if nobody wants this thorn to live. Because remember, it's only a stump. The tree is almost dead because there are no branches, there are no leaves, but the trunk continues to survive. In a sense, probably Wordsworth is always also conveying the idea that life is eternal. Life wants to go on. So whatever the parasites in nature around the trunk, around the thorn might try to do, it continues to survive. It continues to fight. The romantic spirit. Remember, I've already talked about the French Revolution in the beginning of the lecture, if you remember. What it gave to the human mind, the conscious effort for liberty and fraternity, and more importantly, equality. Let us look at another poem. It's called The Idiot Boy. I have tried, my dear students, to give you 3 kinds of poems. Look at the poem on your screen. It's called The Idiot Boy. The first one was Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. The second one was The Thorn. And the third one that I want to talk to you about now is The Idiot Boy. It's 8 o'clock, a clear March night. The moon is up, the sky is blue. The owlet in the moonlight air shouts from nobody knows where. He lengthens out his lonely shout, halloo, halloo, a long halloo. Why bustle thus about your door? What means this bustle, Betty Foy? Why are you in this mighty fret? And why on horseback have you set him whom you love, your idiot boy? So it's, that's a conversational tone. But you notice how simple the poem is. How easily one can understand the feeling that the poet wants to convey. The title itself tells us something about the poem, about the poet, about the characters in the poem. We get to know a lot. I have tried to bring you something about what the Lyrical Ballads is all about. But I think this lecture would be incomplete if I do not talk to you also about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Remember, we think of the preface to the Lyrical Ballads almost as being a separate text in itself. Why do we do that? Why is it that what Wordsworth is saying about what he wanted to do almost seems to be more important than what he did in his poems? You are free to ask such a question, and you would be justified, my dear students, in asking a question. He published the poems. As I told you, 23 poems were published in 1798 in a volume called Lyrical Ballads. You'd be shocked, you'd be surprised to know that there was very, very negative acceptance, I wouldn't even use the word acceptance, reaction to these poems. The criticism that these poems had to face were tremendous because remember, the English reading public had got used to the neoclassical kind of poetry, and suddenly 2 people tell us what kind of poetry we should read, what kind of poetry is important, what kind of poetry should be appreciated. They call their poems experiments, I agree, but yet they are writing a new kind of poetry. So what did Wordsworth and Coleridge do? What did Wordsworth do, in fact, because he wrote the preface? In the second edition, that is in the 1800 edition of the Lyrical Ballads, he wrote something called the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Prastavana, you're familiar with it. It tells us something about the book. Very often in our country, I think all over the world, in the publishing industry, the preface could be written by somebody else. For example, R.K. Narayan, who is a well-known Indian novelist, and I'm sure you know his Malgudi days, the preface to his first book was written by Graham Greene. So you could have somebody else writing your preface, because that gives you a stamp of approval. If Graham Greene could write a preface, well, there must be something in this novel. And that is why the novel probably gets read or published. Anyway, to come back to my talk about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth wrote this, and today we consider this to be a romantic manifesto. What is it that the romantic age is about? It's almost as if he's beginning, telling us what I want to do. Why am I different? So in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, which is a little long, it's not like the usual preface of about a page and a half. This is a longish preface, my dear students, but I would advise you to read it before you read romantic poetry, or probably after you read romantic poetry. What is it that makes romantic poetry so great? What is it that these poets want to do? And how far do they succeed in what they want to do is what you should be looking at, my dear students. Because literature is also about what the poet wants to say. It's not only about what critics want to say about the poet. And therefore, we look at the preface to the Lyrical Ballads as a romantic manifesto. We look at it as a clear-cut distinction from the neoclassical age. We try to contrast it with the neoclassical age. We also go to the preface to the Lyrical Ballads for that famous quotation, my dear students, about the definition of poetry. All of us know that it is a definition which has come down to us 200 years later also. And what does he call it? It is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. But you just can't have a spontaneous overflow. A spontaneous overflow, you'll have to come back home, as the poets did. As Keats says he did in his Ode to a Nightingale. He heard the song when he was sitting in the garden of his friend's house, but he didn't write the poem there. He came back, and then it is recollected in tranquility. You must have the peace to recollect the same emotions that object of nature inspired in you, evoked in you. And then you begin and write a poem. He then goes on to explain to us who a poet is. I would have loved to read to you passages from Preface to the Lyrical Ballads, but as we are very fond of saying, time is always short, and there's so much more that one can talk about when one talks about the Lyrical Ballads. And therefore, I would advise you to go to your library and get a copy of the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads and read certainly, number 1, the definition of poetry, number 2, who is a poet, and number 3, why do I write in verse? This may be a question that students you find yourself asking. Why is it that some people choose to write in poetry? There are some who are fond of saying that poetry is more difficult, but then there have been poets all the time. Ever since civilization began, we have had poets. So that cannot be the reason. So do go to the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads and try and read why Coleridge and Wordsworth in particular, decided to write in verse, number 1. Number 2, you must also read why he says who is a poet, who can be a poet, who decides to be a poet. And of course, I've already given you the definition of poetry. But it would be interesting to read it in Wordsworth's own words, because it's always nice to see what the writer has to tell us. My dear students, the Lyrical Ballads is one of the greatest works of literature that has come down to us. The Lyrical Ballads is not one poem, and therefore, when one hears the term Lyrical Ballads, one need not wonder, oh, how long is the poem? It is not one poem. It's a collection of poems. It's a collection of some of the best poems that have been written in the Romantic Age. And needless to say, the Romantic Age is one of the greatest ages of poetry in English literature. So if you want to appreciate romantic poetry, if you want to appreciate good poetry in the English language, I'm not discounting the Elizabethan age, but if you want to read subjective, imaginative poems that come from the heart of these great poets, you must read the Lyrical Ballads first, read Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then move on to the second generation of poets, and then read Keats and Shelley and Byron to see what great English poetry is all about. I hope you enjoyed this lecture as much as I have enjoyed talking to you about one of the greatest ages in English literature and two of the greatest poets of all times. Go back and read your books, read Lyrical Ballads, and have a good day. Thank you.